Did you know one of the most famous insults in the English language might have been coined by a smiling, rhyming animal that lives in a Seussian zoo? Welcome to Unboxd Origins. I'm Howie, your resident science geek and accidental trivia sponge.
And I'm Wyatt. I ask the big questions. Sometimes philosophical, often skeptical, always curious.
Today we're digging into how did the word nerd evolve in popular culture? Okay, let's crack this nut of a word open. The story begins curiously enough in 1950 with a little rhyming book called If I Ran the Zoo by Dr. Seuss. In a single perfectly Seussian line, he mentions a creature called a nerd. It's cheeky, it's nonsense, and it's almost certainly the first recorded printed appearance of the word. But Dr. Seuss didn't give us a dictionary definition. He gave us a noun that would go wander off into slang, shapeshift, get bullied, reinvent itself, and then return to the cultural stage with a surprise career change. That's the seed of our origin story. A made-up organism grows legs and walks into the messy club of human language. For that quiet debut, the word began to show up in American newspapers and magazines during the 1950s, not as a cuddly creature, but as a slang insult. Teenagers and young adults in the post-war suburbs needed new vocabulary for social sorting. Who's cool, who's not, and nerd started sitting in the not box. It was often used alongside square and dork, and later terms like dweeb. Words that categorized people for failing to conform to mid-century ideas of masculinity, fashion, and social competence. The world of the 1950s and early 1960s had rigid social hierarchies in high school hallways, and labels were the duct tape that kept those hierarchies together. So nerd functioned as a social enforcement tool. It pointed out who lacked the right clothes, the right hair, the right swagger, and later the right romantic success. Then something else happened. As America moved into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the objects of ridicule, kids who liked books, math, comic strips, sci-fi, didn't just vanish. They organized. They made clubs, conventions, fanzines, and eventually jobs and industries that rewarded the very traits their peers had mocked. The counterintuitive twist is the timeline. Technology, from early computing to the personal computer revolution, gradually transformed bookishness and obvious enthusiasm into marketable skills. By the time Revenge of the Nerds hit movie screens in 1984, nerds were still stock characters to laugh at. But the movie was also a revenge fantasy, literally depicting social outcasts striking back and claiming dignity. That film, like other media moments, helped convert nerd into a narrative category in pop culture, someone second class but potentially heroic, at least in their moral or intellectual purity. Add to that the 1990s and 2000s when the internet became a public thing, and you have a catalytic social dynamic. Online communities let fans find one another. Instead of existing as scattered misfits, people who loved role-playing games, coding, comic books, or obscure fantasy novels could form dense social networks. Together, they amplified their cultural presence. Comic-Con moved from a tiny hobbyist meetup into a massive cultural festival where bookstores, streaming giant booths, and film studios all saw the economic power of that nerd crowd. Meanwhile, the rise of tech billionaires, the very public faces of Gates, Jobs, and later social media founders, reframed nerdiness as not only useful but enviable. The guy who got mocked for tinkering in the basement could now be a boardroom hero. That change wasn't instantaneous, but it recalibrated the social currency attached to intellect, obsession, and eccentricity.
Ha! If I may stop you right there, and I will, because this is the delicious contradiction. The very success of nerd is both a reclamation and a dilution. By the time nerds had dollars, public respect, and blockbuster movies, the term stopped meaning outsider in the way it originally did. It splintered into dozens of flavors. People could be book nerds, food nerds, plant nerds, or film nerds. Suddenly, being a nerd could be about passionate expertise rather than awkward social failure. The astonishing bit is that the communities who were once stigmatized repurposed the label into cultural capital. And then the mainstream bought that capital and planted it on t-shirts. The insult was recoded as a brand. That's the aha. Reclamation turned into commodification, and then commodification got reabsorbed into everyday identity.
Exactly. And we should also note how media portrayed nerds along this arc. In early television and films, nerd characters were often one-dimensional, bespectacled, socially awkward, a comic device. Think of the caricature in early sitcoms, but by the 1990s and certainly the 2000s, shows and movies started layering those characters with agency, humor, and even sexual attractiveness. The Big Bang Theory is a huge example. It normalized a cluster of stereotypical geek behaviors, tabletop games, comic book debates, awkward flirtations, and packaged them as a central, lovable ensemble. That show did more than make nerd talk mainstream. It surgically removed much of the stigma and replaced it with an insider humor that invited everyone to laugh with them rather than at them. That shift is powerful because it changes the social meaning of being nerdy. It becomes an identity group that can be proud, marketable, and sometimes enviable. But hold on, it's not all a tidy success story. We also have to consider who gets to wear the badge of nerd without penalty. Historically, the image of nerds has skewed white and male, even though the actual communities were more diverse. Women, LGBTQ+ folks, and people of color in STEM or fandom often faced additional layers of gatekeeping and harassment. The reclamation of nerd didn't erase those problems. In some contexts, mainstreaming even made them worse by creating an expectation of what nerd identity looks like. Cosplay and conventions have been sites of incredible inclusivity, but also of controversy. So while the word evolved, the lived reality stayed complicated. That complexity is part of why the word nerd retains so much emotional charge. It's a proud banner for some, a nuanced identity for others, and for others still, a reminder of exclusion. Another interesting twist is linguistic. Words don't just change meaning, they spawn relatives. Nerd sits in a family with geek, dweeb, dork, and wonk, but the trajectory of each relative differs. Geek historically had circus connotations, a carnival performer who did shocking stunts, but became a hip synonym for obsessive expertise. Wonk went more specifically into policy and bureaucratic expertise. Meanwhile, dork stayed closer to a social idiot. The way society chooses which signifiers become noble and which remain insults tells us about economic and cultural power. Why? Because in a knowledge economy, expertise is money. When knowledge is scarce and rewarded, the people who embody it get prestige. Their labels are glorified. So the mainstreaming of the nerd coincided with an economy that rewarded their skill set.
Ah! And let's not ignore self-branding in the social media age. People now actively cultivate nerd identities because it helps them find tribes, sponsors, and audience members. Being a nerd can be a content strategy. You see it in YouTube channels, Instagram accounts for niche hobbies, and Twitch streams where every niche interest can be monetized. That's a further stage of evolution. The term becomes a professional identity. But there's a philosophical snag. When your hobby is also your brand, does the term retain its previous authenticity? The joyous, slightly tragic outsider who loved things for their own sake becomes an entrepreneur of delight. That shift invites us to consider whether the reclaimed term retains its original countercultural punch or becomes another mainstream product.
Speaking of industry, we should also credit how corporations adopted the aesthetics of nerd culture to sell things. Comic book characters became billion-dollar film franchises. Retro sci-fi fashion became runway trends. Nerd chic, wearing glasses without lenses, thank you very much, entered fashion dictionaries. Tech companies marketed themselves as nerd-friendly workplaces with beanbag chairs and free snacks, blending the idea that a relaxed, obsessive environment breeds genius. That corporate co-opting helped propel the word into the positive stratosphere. But it also sanitized parts of the identity that were once communal and subversive. This is the classic cultural life cycle: underground, mainstream fascination, commercialization. Nerd followed that path and now sits as both a proud declaration and a selling point. Another interesting cultural mechanism in the evolution was humor, especially self-deprecating humor. When people who were labeled nerds started to make jokes about their own obsessions, it shifted how audiences interpreted them. Self-reference turned powerlessness into agency. Nerds could mock themselves on their own terms, control the narrative, and thereby reduce the sting of the insult. That comedic turn is partly why mainstream television made nerd characters sympathetic. Comedy humanizes difference, but humor is double-edged. Self-mockery can be emancipatory, but it can also reinforce stereotypes if it becomes the only acceptable way for a group to be visible. That's why the modern nerd identity often includes a conscious push to diversify representations and show a range of experiences beyond the punchline.
Aha! Another overlooked piece, and I think this is crucial, is the role of community rituals in transforming the label. Think about conventions, LAN parties, first-gen BBS forums, and the early fanzines. Rituals create meaning. By practicing shared rituals, debates about canon, cosplay rituals, hackathons, communities turned nerd from an adjective into a culture. Those rituals produced insiders and outsiders, sure, but they also produced social capital, norms, expertise, and a sense of belonging. Once you have rituals, you have a culture that others want to join or commodify. That's why many of the most potent transformations came from within. People who loved something intensely created the very value that later mainstream culture would claim as trendy.
So where does that leave us today? Nerd is a polyvalent badge, sometimes flattering, sometimes ironic, sometimes aspirational. It's also a flex. Calling oneself a nerd signals depth, devotion, and expertise. But we must remember the structural conditions that enabled the flip. Economic shifts that reward knowledge, media that empathizes with formerly mocked archetypes, and social platforms that allow niche communities to scale. Without those forces, a cute Dr. Seuss creature might have remained a textual oddity with no social career. Instead, that single syllable hopped off the page and became an identity with world historical weight.
And why does that matter beyond nostalgia or branding? Because words shape reality. When a term like nerd goes from insult to honorific, it changes who gets encouraged to pursue certain paths. In schools and homes, the stories we tell about geeks and nerds affect whether a child pursues math, coding, comics, or culinary science without shame. The reclamation of nerd has a real-world moral component. It democratizes curiosity and makes it acceptable to be deeply interested in something. That is socially valuable. Yet the flip side remains. As nerd became marketable, gatekeepers sometimes enforce who gets to be called a real nerd and who is just a trendy wannabe. So our work as cultural consumers is to keep the label open, equitable, and honest.
To wrap this origin up simply, the word nerd began as a nonsensical creature, became an insult, was reclaimed by communities, and then rebranded by culture and commerce. It's a linguistic palimpsest, layers of meaning written over meaning, telling us about social power, economic incentives, and the human capacity to band together around joy. The trajectory from ridicule to pride shows that language is not fate. It's a terrain where people negotiate identity, belonging, and value.
And the deeper takeaway: labels can wound and heal. Reclaiming a slur or a pejorative term is an act of agency, but once reclaimed, the term invites fresh scrutiny. Who profits? Who is visible? And who remains excluded? The story of nerd is a microcosm of cultural evolution. It shows that identity is both personal and political, and that a single syllable can carry decades of history about what a society values.
If you like unpicking words and watching culture do its somersaults, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and share this episode with a friend who proudly carries a comic book tote bag.
So, did a Dr. Seuss creature really start one of the most surprising makeovers in pop culture? Maybe. But whether it was a rhyming beast or human social dynamics that changed our language, the bigger question is, what other tiny words out there are quietly plotting their own careers?